Welcome to Tanakh Talk. I'm your host, William Hall, broadcasting live out of Kingsland, Texas, USA, with another episode of our Debunking Missionary Claims. This is number 26, The Historical Jesus, part number 3, Jesus in the Talmud. With Rabbi Moshe Shulman. Rabbi, welcome back. It's always a pleasure to have you here.
Oh, how you doing?
I think a lot of people are getting sending a lot of good feedback on the show. So it's definitely a pleasure having you here and being back in the studio as always.
Okay.
So you were saying this particular section we're almost coming to a close, and there's a lot more interesting stuff to come. So don't.
We pretty much finished with Jesus outside of the New Testament this time. Next time probably.
Okay.
I can get it both in. The Talmud, I'm going to try and spend a little bit longer on it because the missionaries make a big deal about it as being a proof. As we saw before, if we look at the material that we've seen until now, there really isn't very much telling us about Jesus, at least in non-Christian sources.
Right.
We looked at the Roman sources that we have. Basically, they don't come about until the start of the 2nd century. And even then, it's mostly probably secondhand material that they've heard from Christians themselves. They don't seem to know anything firsthand.
Right. The
most interesting one of all is, I think, Pliny's letters to Trajan, which besides the historical stuff, is just seeing how a governor at that time, talking about 2,000 years ago, basically almost, how they interacted between the governor and the emperor in Rome. So that was sort of interesting. So we see a little bit about Christians and Christian worship by the time of the beginning of the 2nd century. Nice. But basically everything else, it seems to be rumors and nasty things sent about Christians. And that's about it. So we don't really see very much outside. So the next place we're going to go to is actually in the Talmud, because there are a number of passages that we find there that Christians have claimed refer to Jesus.
Right, I've heard that.
And give us some support for them, their ideas. Now, you should know that many of these were actually censored out of the Talmud. Our Talmuds were actually censored in Europe. We have copies of the Talmud that come from Sephardic lands, from non-European lands, so we're able to get some of them. And they actually came out with a cipher. You can see it here, but of course it's backwards because of the way it looks. It's called Chasronis Hashas. Those things that were missing in the Talmud that were taken out by the Catholic Church for various reasons. Most of them because they tried to talk about Jesus or supposed denigrating in a denigrating way to Christians. Sometimes they would change words, like we talked about non-Jews in general. The word goy would be used for non-Jews in general, and since that would include Christians, they put in the word that refers to people who worship Avodah Zarah, so that we wouldn't be implying that they are also covered to them. But essentially, these things were pulled out, many of them. They now appear in our Talmuds today, have all put them back in because we don't have to worry about censors. Well, we could actually read the uncensored text. So we can actually analyze and evaluate what actually is in these texts. Now, these texts talk about a certain person living in a certain historical period of time that Christians believe may, in fact, refer to Jesus. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about, there's basically two that are there. And we're going to mention a couple other passages in the Talmud which are used as Christian sources sometimes. But the main ones are basically one referring to a person called Yishai HaNotzer. Notzer seems to be similar to Notzri. So the feeling is that maybe that's talking about Jesus. Yishai is closer to Yeshua, although it's known that it actually is not. It's actually the first letters of a sentence, meaning that his name should be wiped out. The meaning being is that this person was a heretic, and the rabbis don't mention names of people who are wicked, as it says in Mishlei, Sham Elishuam Iyerkav, the name of the wicked should wither. And because of that, we don't mention, in the Talmud doesn't mention the names of wicked people very often. So, for example, Rabbi Meir had a Rebbe who was his teacher, Elisha ben Avuya was his name. But in the Talmud, they always refer to him as Acher, the other one, because he became a pagan. He left Judaism completely, and so it's Judaism. The Jews, from the Talmud times on, don't mention the name of wicked people. So having the similarity to Yeshua doesn't mean anything. We'll see that it's pretty doubtful whether this refers to him at all. So, okay, the first text that we're going to look at appears in the Talmud in two places, basically the same thing. One is in Sanhedrin 107b, and the other is Masechta Sotah 47a. So let me look for Chassanis Hashas. Okay. Let me put you up here so I can see a little bit better. And then you can see my face also at the same time.
Good plan. Good plan.
You always want to see my face.
Oh, of course. Of course.
Okay. Now, this is 107. Now, what's going on in the Talmud here? The Talmud here is talking about how we're supposed to treat people, that we shouldn't push them away. So it says, I will just translate it going, you shouldn't do it like you did to Elisha, who pushed away, like Elisha pushed away Gehazi with both of his hands. Remember, Gehazi was the attendant of Elisha, and Elisha threw him out because he was taking money. Now here comes what was excised. The Lo Rabbi Yeshua ben Parachia, not like Rabbi Yeshua ben Parachia, Shedach Poi Lo Yishai B'Shtay Yudayim, who pushed away Yisha with both of his hands. Gehazi goes on, talks about Gehazi, then it goes back to Rabbi Yeshua ben Parachia, Ma'hi Kedachina. What happened? What was the story? So it tells a story, historical event. Kedachine Yanai Malka V'Rabunan. When King Yain, we call him Yochanan, but Yanai, somewhat end of the 2nd century BCE, he killed the Pharisees, and the rest of them fled to other places. Rabbi Shimon Parachia and Yishai, who was his student at the time, went to Alexandria of Mitzrayim in Egypt. Alexandria of Mitzrayim, we might call it because there are a number of cities named Alexandria. Alexander the Great made and built a number of cities called after himself. So he was talking about one, Alexandria Mitzrayim. Alexandria Mitzrayim was a very big city. Philo, by the way, came from Alexandria Mitzrayim. It had a very large Jewish population, very large, and had a large Jewish quarter there. The Jews were segregated there, and a large population. And when there was peace, he sent to Shimon ben Shetach, who was in Yerushalayim. When there was peace, Shimon ben Shetach sent to Yerushalayim. Shimon ben Shetach, his sister was married to Yanai HaMelech, the king. And he told them that he was living in it was a wasteland, and they should all come back. So what happened is, Rabbi Shimon Parachia started praising the woman who this guest house was at, how good were her actions, how great she was, how good she did to how she did things with them very well. She was a very nice person, and how pretty she was. So then Yishai says to him, "But Rebbe, her eyes don't look very nice. She doesn't look very pretty, actually." So a wicked person, we're coming here to learn Torah and things, and you're worried about, you're looking at women, you're looking at how pretty she looks. So immediately he pushed him away. Later on, Yeshua wanted to come to him, but at that time when he was coming to him, he was in the middle of his prayers and didn't notice him. So because of that, this Yeshua went away and he went to worship idols. Let's talk about it. Now, an important thing, this is, by the way, repeated similarly in Sotah 47a. One of the things that has to be noted here is that it's historically dated. What's the date of this Yeshua? He lived in the time of Yanai HaMelech, which was long before Herod. There were a number of kings after Yanai HaMelech who until the Romans actually took over. So we're talking about 150 something or more years before Jesus could have even been born. Okay, this is the primary text. This is the first text. Now, there's a second text that appears in Sanhedrin also. And that's 43a. And here's what it says here. This is continuing again. It's again talking about Yishai. What happened is Yishai was known to be Ovid Vodazora, so he was actually executed afterwards. That's what it says here. So it says here. Yeah. Okay, it says, Batani, we learned in a teaching Brisa, which is a few hundred years after that. In Erev Pesach, Yishai was hung. What happened? For 40 days, they called out and asked, said that he was going to be hung because he was a magician, and also that he turned people away from the Torah. So for 40 days, they came out and asked, is there anybody who knows anything good about him? So the Gemara immediately asked the question. We know that the general rule is if somebody who tries to convince other people to worship idols and to go away from the Torah, we don't look for anything. Once he's been convicted, we don't even look to turn it back, whereas in other things we might want to look to turn back. So the Gemara says the reason why they did it is that he was close to the king. He had political connections. Now, another important point, well, it does say that this particular person was hung. And what that means, essentially, he was stoned and then hung up. If you look in the Torah, you find out that in Deuteronomy, that's what you do. After the person has been stoned, they hang him up for the rest of the day, and then they take him down. So, what do we see here from this? What we see is something very interesting. There are some things that have similarity to the Jesus story, but they don't really appear. They have serious problems with them. The first one is, of course, the early passage that we have of this Yishai is he's living in a certain time, and this continues it. And the second one, this one says something else besides being the same person, or we seem to believe it's the same person. It gives us some information which doesn't really jive, doesn't fit with what they have in the New Testament, what we know about Jesus, that he was close to the Kurvla Malchus, means he was close to the government. He was maybe a government agent or something like that. So the time of Sheba ben Parachia is about 110 BCE, putting a period of about 150 years beforehand. So that's the first text that's usually used. Clearly, this is not it. Clearly, this would present a problem for the Christians. Now, the second one is where there's a discussion about somebody called Ben Satata or Ben Pendura. This is somewhat important because we find later that Celsus writes that some people refer to Jesus as Ben Pendura, that he was a bastard child of somebody in Pendura. And so this seems to have some similarities here in the Talmud. We'll look at this also because this also presents some interesting problems. So in Sanhedrin 67a, okay, it talks about when somebody brings somebody to be stoned to the Beis Din. This is what they did in Satata in Lod, the city of Lod. Now, according to that, it appears that Ben Satata lived in the city of Lod when the Sanhedrin was in Lod, which is a long time after the destruction of the temple, and they hung him up Erpat. So now the comment asks, Ben Satata, Ben Pendira, that his name isn't Ben Satata, his name is Ben Pendira. Okay, that's the name that we know in Celsus also here. Ben Satata, Bo Pendira. That his mother's husband's name was Satata, but the person who was actually the father was Pendira. And what was the husband's name? Papas ben Yehuda. His name was Papas ben Yehuda. Okay, so what we see here is somebody ben Pendira who was hung, and He was called Ben Pendita because he was a bastard child. This person was made his wife pregnant, but the real father, the real husband's name was Papas Ben Yehuda. Papas Ben Yehuda is very important to remember who this guy is, because we need to know who it is. And to find out, let's go into another place, and that is in Tractate Shabbos 104. In Tractate Shabbos 104, it also mentions Ben Sada to bring the same story. But there we have something very important. We have a Tosfos. Tosfos is a commentary from the students from Rashi, for a few generations, actually, not just directed students, but a few generations. And the nature of Tosfos is essentially this. We have the Gemara, the Talmud, with Rashi's explanation. Rashi tries to explain the simple parts of it. But sometimes there's questions that arrive from different passages of the Talmud and different questions. So Tosfos is always asking a question, trying to get down to a fundamental understanding of what's in the text. So this text, Tosfos here is an interesting question. Who is it? Ben Sadata. Ben Pendita, there's a history, something that might refer to Jesus, but there's a problem here. So he explains what the problem is here. Omer Rabbeinu Tam was the grandson of Rashi, one of the most important authors we find in Tosfos. That this is not Yisha Notzi. This is not Yisha Notzi. Whether he means Yisha Notzi from Sanhedrin or Yisha Notzi meaning the founder of Christianity. Why? Jehu ben Satata Okay, this Ben Satata was in the time of Pippus ben Yehuda. Okay, and who is this Pippus ben Yehuda? He was somebody who was in the time of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva was in the 130s, fully 100 years after Jesus was supposed to have died. As we see in Tractate Bruchos. The Yishai, Hoi b'yom Yeshiva ben Parachia. But Yishai, Hanotzi, was in time of Yeshiva ben Parachia, which of course is 100 something years ago. As we find him in the last chapter of Sotah, he's talking about 47, which I mentioned here. Which says, so what do we see from Tosfos? Tosfos is saying something very simple. This Pendura lived in the time of Rabbi Akiva, which is much later. So he can't be Yisha Notzi that we have from Sanhedrin, because Yisha Notzi lived in the time of Sheba Parachia. So this can't be the same person. And of course, he can't be, so he lived in that time. Now, there's another view that I saw. There's a view that actually, Papas ben Yehuda was a Talmud for Yochanan ben Zakkai, which would also place him much too late. Yochanan ben Zakkai was really the Rebbe of everybody after the destruction of the temple, would put him maybe 20, 30 years before Rabbi Akiva. So it's around the same time, but not exactly. Or it could be actually the same thing. I'm not sure. Depending how young Papas ben Yehuda was at the time. But the main point of this is that, as Tosfos points out here, a serious problem, Ben Pendura is not Yisha Hanotzi. It's apparently two different people, living in two different times. So how are we going to understand all these things? We have a Yishai, and we have Ben Pendura. So let's go and see what the rabbis say about it. This is pretty good. But what we won't see is anybody living in the first century. So there are a few views about this, and let's look at what they are. Now, we mentioned Tosfos. Tosfos' view is that neither one of them appear to be the real Jesus who lived in that time, unless we say that it's Yeshua ben Parach. The one who lived Yeshua ben Parach is the one who was the real Yishai. Okay, that's somewhat unclear. It's possible that it's neither one of them, because we know that Rabbi Yechiel from Orleans, in his Paris debate, said specifically that Jesus is not mentioned in the Talmud at all, because neither of these characters were. However, we have in the letter from Yemen to Yemen, from the Rambam, he says that actually Yeshua Parachia, the one who lived in the time of Yeshua Parachia, was the real Jesus of the New Testament. Okay. Also, we have the Ramban in his disputation here's what he says. He says, and his birth was close to 200 years before the destruction. Okay? According to what the truth is. And this is before their calculation of about 70 something years. Okay? This same view is kept by, approved by some of the David, Avram ben David, who wrote a Sefer Kabbalah, which is basically history. We find a similar type thing is said in a few other places. Okay. We also find that Abarbanel says that. Let me see if I can find Abarbanel here a second. The Abarbanel says that we find in the Talmud that one of the students of Yeshua ben Parachia, who was from the third generation from Anshe G'dayla Gedola, and he said that this Talmud was actually the real Yeshua, who lived at a time much earlier. So according to these views, they say that this person in the time of Yeshua ben Parachia was Jesus. Now, one point we have to make here clearly. The issue in the Talmud is not whether Jesus is existed or not. That's taken as a given. The question is, we have historical people mentioned in the Talmud. Does this have anything to do with the real Jesus, person who lived in the first century, or the Christian believed in the first century? Now, these views I just said, the Rambam and the Ramban explicitly say that the real Jesus actually lived, is the one that's mentioned in the time of Mashiach ben Parachia, and that is like 70-something years before he was born, and he died 100 years or so after his birth, when he was supposed to be born. So it's obviously not the person in the New Testament. There's obviously a problem. Now, there are other views that are brought. There's a view brought that there are actually two Yeshua ben Parachias, one living at the early time, and a second one living at the time in the beginning of the first century, so that it's possible that Jesus could be that one. That's not very popular. Now, as Ben Pandita, the one who was in Lod, the one who was living at the time of Papas Ben Yehuda, nobody says that that's Jesus. We don't have any sources that say that that is. Now, interesting enough, there's a work called Toldos Yishai that's out there. Basically, this was, I think, written to bring together all these things into one, and it actually says that both are the same person. But Sadata, the Talmud from Yishai, brings all these things together, mixing all these periods of time, puts it together into one thing. And the final view we find among the rabbis is essentially that none of them. This is, I mentioned Rabbi Hill from Paris and the Meiri. Okay, so I'm going to give my view a little bit later, but I think we can see clearly what the problem is here. The main problem is, of course, that historically, if you're going to accept it, there are, some historical problems there. There are times are not really fitting in to the times don't fit what is claimed for when Jesus lived, which would have been in the early first century.
Right.
Okay. Now, this, of course, everything I say is actually known. As I say, the scholars look at this kind of stuff and they consider, well, do we consider it being true or not? What do we say about this? So, what I'd like to do is let's first look at basically the secular scholars that I have. Names that you might be familiar with some of them, not with others. The first one is Bart Ehrman. Everybody knows who he is, so let's go to him. He's, I would say, the secular scholar par excellence as far as these kinds of things are concerned. So here's what Bart Ehrman says. These references, I've said, come hundreds of years after Jesus' life and appear to represent Jewish responses to the Christian claims about Jesus. They do not, that is, appear to provide historical reliable information about what Jesus said, did, and experienced. Okay, so his view is that, in fact, these are not valid historical records of things, of people living. So, for example, that person didn't live in the time of Shimon ben Parachia. These were just written as an answer to the Christians. Another work from Peter Schaeffer, Jesus in the Talmud, which is a very interesting and long one, he talks about these passages. And this is what he says about them. This is precisely what takes place in our rabbinic stories about Jesus and the Christian sect. These stories are deliberate and carefully retelling, not of what really happened, but of what has come to or captured the rabbi's attention. The source to which they refer is not some independent knowledge of Jesus, his life, and his followers that has reached them through some hidden channels. But rather, as I could show in detail, it is the New Testament, almost exclusively four Gospels, as we know it, or in a form similar to the one we have today. Hence, the rabbinic stories in most cases are a retelling of the New Testament narrative, a literary answer to a literary text. Okay, so he says that this is an answer. I want to point out a point here that he's saying. He's pointing out that, in fact, there are similarities between certain things in the New Testament and these rabbinic stories. And his view is, in fact, that the influence is going from the gospel to the rabbinic stories, not vice versa. Just want to point that out. Another work is by somebody far out there. This is called the Book of Jesus Legend by G.A. Wells. G.A. Wells is known as probably one of the most famous of the mythicists who believe that Jesus didn't exist. But later on, he seems to have changed to taking the point of view that Jesus probably did exist, but actually all the material we have is bogus and it's legendary, and we couldn't really know more than the fact that the person probably existed. So he remarks with regards to these passages. In sum, by the time rabbis came to mention Jesus at all, he had come to be represented by Christians themselves as a teacher and wonder worker, a kind of person as familiar to the rabbis as to his pagan critics. His point here being, of course, is what we saw from before, as those who wrote about Jesus basically had second, third hand knowledge and really didn't know about him directly. They just wrote from those stories and made fun based on them. Vermes, who regards the first three Gospels as fundamentally reliable, has nevertheless said, in an age and society in which a combination of sanctity and the miraculous was considered normal, Jesus' talents and activities fitted the image of the holy man. Brown, I think you're talking about Raymond Brown, who wrote a number of Death and Messiah and other works. Brown concedes that apart from the testimony of Josephus, which I discussed below, we have practically no Jewish evidence from the period of 600 to 100 that would tell us how Jews looked on Jesus, his followers, and their claims about him. Now, remember, we talked about Josephus last time. I put Josephus first because historically it would be that way. And from Josephus, we see that the passage really talking about Jesus we have there is probably bogus. The highest probably is that it's bogus, and it just tells us nothing we don't know. Brown's fellow Catholic mayor agrees that in the earliest rabbinic sources, there is no clear or even probable reference to Jesus of Nazareth. And that when we do find such references in later rabbinic literature, they are most probably reactions to Christian claims, oral or written. But again, the view is that whatever appears in the rabbinic writing is only because it's taken from the Christians, what they claim, and distorted to sort of answer them. Nor is there any mention of Jesus or indeed any New Testament Dead Sea Scrolls, although certain scholars have claimed to see Jesus and John the Baptist described on the symbolic names of these texts. Okay. Again, he's quoting various sources. The bottom line from these sources is that the information in the Talmud, according to these scholarly sources, the information in the Talmud is actually not firsthand, but in fact attempts to answer the Christians. Now, in a sense, we do have something that does support that type of an idea, and that is the work Told Shisha. Told Shisha takes all of these Christian things, all these things about somebody that could have been considered to be Jesus, puts them all together into one big story, and says, this is what happened with him. And it brings all kinds of different things, scurrilous things. Okay? So let's read the Christians. Now, here when we go to the Christians, is very interesting. The Christian scholars want to embrace the Talmud in one way or another. They want to embrace the Talmud and say that, the Talmud really knew what was going on. So let's first at F.F. Bruce. F.F. Bruce brings not just this one, but it brings also a few other sources. So he brings the Gemara that we talked about in Sanhedrin 43a about having been killed the day before Passover, and saying that he was close to the kingship. So this is what Bruce says. The Baraitha agrees with the Gospel of John in saying that Jesus was hanged on Passover Eve. No word here about whether did the Gospel get it, whether did the rabbinic get it from the Christians and distort it for their words, as the scholars say. Said no, they knew what they're talking about. There's a tradition that Jesus, and this is actually Jesus. And remember, this is Jesus that's talking about here, who was executed the day before Passover. Yishai. This is somebody who lives in the time of Yeshiva and Parachia, according to the Talmud, which of course causes a serious problem for the Christian. If you're going to say that this is the real Jesus, then of course you're agreeing with the Rambam and the Ramban that Jesus lived in the time of Yeshiva and Parachia about, and you know, I'm talking about a period of time, 100 years before actually Jesus died. So again, he talks more. He mentions Ben Pandira. Ben Pandira, as we pointed out before, Tosfos and other places, Ben Pandira lived in the time after destruction, either in the time of Rabbi Akiva or maybe slightly earlier, slightly as being a student of Yochanan ben Zakkai, but he did live in that time. Now, what does he say about that? Now, he said, according to Origen, Pandira was a surname of Jesus' grandfather, Jacob. This was his reply to a Jewish calumny quoted by Celsus that Pandira was the name of a pagan soldier. So, he is accepting what's in contra Celsus, that in fact Pandira was in fact a relative of Jesus' grandfather, not his father, whatever, but saying that again, that story is historically accurate. But then again, you have the problem with the Talmud. The Talmud says that this person, Pandira, lived after the destruction of the temple between 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Well, excuse me, between either 60 years, time of Rabbi Akiva, or maybe 20, 30 years afterwards. Let's continue. He has a few other ones here. Now, he brings here, I didn't mention this story. He brings two other stories here that are very interesting. This is usually not discussed because it's not a discussion directly about Jesus, but it's a discussion about Christianity. And I believe that actually, if you look at the stories, actually there's two stories here. If you look at these two stories, it's actually somewhat of a support for the view of the scholars that say that occasionally the rabbis would write stories in order to make fun as opposed to bringing historical events. So here's this in the Talmud Tractate Shabbos 116a. It's a very funny story. What happened is that there was a particular judge who was known to be a Christian. And this was in the time of Rabban Gamliel, which would be after the destruction of the temple. So what happened is Rabban Gamliel had a sister named Ima Shulam. And what happened is their father died, so they went to this judge to argue about the inheritance. Now, the Torah law of inheritance is very simple. The son inherits, and the daughter does not. But if the son is not alive, then the daughter inherits. It's in the Torah. So what happened is Imishom sent him a golden land. When it came before him, she said, "Please divide to me the property of the women's quarters." He said to them, "Divide it so." So they said now to this judge who was going against the Torah, they said to him, "For us it is written, where there is a son, a daughter does not inherit." Okay, this judge, this Christian judge, he said to them, "Since the day that you were exiled from the land, the law of Moses has been abrogated, and the law of the Evangelion, the gospel, has been given, in which it says, a son and daughter shall inherit alike." Okay. She bought off the judge. This Christian was a judge and bought him off. Okay, next. what happened. Next day, Gamaliel sent him a Libyan ass, which apparently is a donkey of some sort. The judge then said to him, I've looked further to the end of that book, and in it is written, I have not come to take away from the law of Moses, and I have not come to add to the law of Moses. Now, the law of Moses, it is written, where there is a son and a daughter does not inherit. Okay? She said to him, let your light shine as a lamp, in order to hint to him, obviously, about the golden lamp she gave him. And Gamaliel said to her, the ass has come and trodden out the lamp. The donkey that he gave us. Well, this is obviously written to make fun of the Christians. Much later. Okay? Most people believe that that's the case of what it is. And it certainly seems to be a little bit on the funny side. There are many reasons why I would say that. First of all, it assumes that the book of Matthew was already written and circulated enough that the rabbis would know about it in the time just after the destruction of the temple. Gamaliel was actually right after the destruction of the temple. This is Gamaliel from Yavna. Excuse me. I don't remember the story. Yavna was set up right after the destruction of the temple. So that would put him then. So that would put it about the year 70, which is a little bit too early to assume that Matthew had enough circulation that the Jewish rabbis would know it would be said, that it should even be a Christian judge that would be doing such a thing. Okay, now he brings another one. Now this is a continuation of Sanhedrin 43a that I mentioned before. Okay, this is another one. Now he seems to indicate what do you say here, Professor? Okay, he seems to be making a big deal of the fact that they mentioned Evangelion, which is Latin, I believe, not Greek, Evangelion, and also that indicating they knew about the book of Matthew. So it makes a very big thing, but the rabbis knew about it at that time. But obviously, this would have to be much later. Okay, the next one is a very interesting one. The rabbis taught this in Sanhedrin continues. I'll just read what he has here rather than going back. Jesus had 5 disciples: Mattai, Nakai, Netzer, Buni, and Toda. So these 5 are all brought to the court for execution. So Mattai was brought before the court. He said to them, should Mattai be put to death, since it's written, I, Mattai, shall come and appear before God? The Hebrew makes a joke, and then it gives an answer to each one. To each one, they bring a verse to try and say why he should, and then he gives an answer is why he should be executed. Okay? Now, historically, there's lots of problems with this. First of all, the Jewish courts did not execute anybody at that time. The Romans did, as is well known. And the whole thing looks a little bit funny. And in fact, Bruce, let me read what Bruce says now. I just want to get something to drink. If you read what Bruce says here, Bruce says it like this. Most of the story about the 5 disciples are a rabbinic game in which the disciples and the judges engage in competitive wordplay by treating a common word in some familiar passage of Hebrew scripture as a personal name. It has no historical value. So even he agrees it doesn't have any historical value. Okay, so how does it conclude here? Now, we've gone through some of these passages. The ones in the Talmud that we have, the one would have Jesus at the time of Shimon Parachia or at the time of Rabbi Akiva, which time-wise doesn't fit out, but he accepts them to be valid. And then we have the story of Meshulam, which he accepts to be an indication that the rabbis knew about the New Testament at that time in the first century, and that the story was somewhat valid, which of course it seems far-fetched. And likewise, the story about at least the story about the 5 Talmidim. Mattai is the only one that seems to Matthew, but the rest of them don't seem to correspond to anybody. And their names seem to be like jokes. So it's pretty much, even he agrees that that's a little bit too far-fetched. But at the end, this is what he says. The rabbis of this period then were not unacquainted with the story of Jesus and the activities of his followers, vigorously as they voiced a dissent from all that he and they stood for. So, he seems to indicate that he believes that they had first-hand knowledge of Jesus of some sort. Again, he would be very inclined to that, because after all, if the Jews did have first-hand knowledge of Jesus, that of course adds to our question of historicity. However, he ignores the real problems with it, which we will get to next. Now, in Gary Habermas, a very well-known Christian, talks about these passages. He mentions a passage in 43a, and he really is going to wring this out for the best he can. Okay? Okay. So, what does it say? Well, we learn from this a number of facts. Number one, Jesus' death by crucifixion. Number two, the time of the event when it was mentioned twice occurring the eve of Passover, meaning that John was right and the synoptics are wrong, by the way. That 40 days beforehand it was publicly announced that Jesus would be stoned. Well, not specifically recorded in the New Testament, such as certainly consistent with both the Jewish practice and report. Problem, of course, he makes here is that Jesus was arrested, of course, and according to the New Testament, arrested and executed within a very short amount of time. He didn't have 40 days, but whatever. Don't let little facts get in the way of his trying to build up his argument. That Jesus was judged by the Jews to be guilty of sorcery and spiritual apostasy, and leading Israel astray by his teachings. That doesn't really correspond to what it says in the New Testament either. All that is something that we know later has been claimed about Jesus. Okay, it is also stated that since no witnesses came forward to defend him, he was killed. That doesn't really mean anything. That's whatever. Okay. Now here it makes a factual error. There's no explanation to why Jesus was crucified. It doesn't say crucified, it says hanged. He's saying hanged means crucified, which is not correct. When stoning was a prescribed punishment. Of course, Habermas, of course, does not know what the halacha is. The law is that, in fact, you were stoned first, and you were hung up until the end of the day, and then taken down and buried. Whatever. Okay, and let's see what else we have. From the second thing that we see there, the students had mentioned, it says, in fact, he said some to the disciples, that some among the Jews felt that these men were also guilty of actions that warranted execution. So that he fetches out of this much he can. Out of two passages, that the second passage, I mean, is just not believed to have been have any factual basis at all. I mean, even to his credit, Bruce didn't think that there was any fact in that, whereas Habermas is just bringing it into it. What we're seeing here is that when it comes to anything historical, because the historical record is so non-existent, because of the total non-existence in the historical record of anything about Jesus, they try and squeeze out from some things that are just not there. Darrell Bach. I don't know how much you know from Dallas Theological Seminary. I've met him before. He's a very nice fellow. But in this case, he's also wrong. Or in many cases, he's also wrong. So here he discusses both passages 43a and 107b. And I would just mention with regards to 43a, with these passages, 43a, what does he say? This text has several interesting points. The clear apologetic claim that 40-day period was allowed for people to come to Jesus' defense contrasts with the gospel portion of rush to judgment. Okay, so he notices there's a problem with it. The mention of hanging and stoning is the traditional way that Judaism referred to the death penalty. That's quite true. The dating text appears to correspond with John's chronology, which of course he's admitting, by the way, that there is a contradiction between John and the synoptics. We will discuss that later when we talk about the New Testament and historical problems with the New Testament and also the resurrection. If the allusion to Jesus' connection to the government is an allusion to his Davidic ancestry, then there is an implicit remark of residential claim to kingship. Unfortunately, Bach is incorrect. Court of Malchus means what it means. When somebody was a government official, they referred to him as in court of Malchus. He was close to the kingship. So that's actually incorrect. With regards to the one in 107, about Paschal marriage or whatever. Once again, the charges are claimed about the exercise of unusual powers, and witness will say, in fact, the 2 points appear in the same order in the early text from above. Okay, so fine. Bach is accepting this as having somewhat of historical weight to it, having some kind of historical value to it. Okay. The last one I'm bringing is Robert Van Voorst. Robert Van Voorst, as I mentioned to you when I've used him before, He is a professor of New Testament at Western Theological Seminary in Michigan. Okay? And here's what he says, and I will read it in a little bit. He actually, among Christians, is very truthful and very astute in what he says here. Some rabbinic traditions concerning Jesus may represent responses to Christian preaching from the end of the first century, not from the time of Jesus. We have seen how the tradition of Jesus' illegitimacy and the Ben Pentira story related to it arose from the Christian doctrine of the virgin birth. This doctrine was not explicitly formulated by Christians until near the end of the first century, Matthew and Luke, and even then may not have been widely shared as a leading doctrine by other Christians, Pauline and Johannine churches, for example. What he's trying to say is, obviously, remember, the early Gospels were not universal in the sense that everybody had them. You would have one gospel in your church. So those people who had the Gospel of Matthew and Luke would know about the virgin birth. But those who didn't, were Pauline church or John, something like that, they wouldn't know about it. Also, the presentation of Jesus' trial and death in Sanhedrin 48 seems to represent a Jewish rebuttal to Christian traditions about Jesus' death. It cannot be claimed to represent early independent information about Jesus, even though, according to the Synoptic accounts, some leading Pharisees were present at the trial of Jesus. This is very sober. Look at it. All the general information that the rabbis have on Jesus could have been derived from Christian preaching. Christians proclaimed Jesus a miracle worker, and the rabbis knew that Christians continued to work healing miracles as well. Once the rabbis tacitly admitted that Jesus' miracles, like those of at least some Christians in their own day, actually took place, the only way to explain it was to say that they were done by magic. That Jesus was executed and raised from the dead were also key points of all Christian preaching. That his overall life could be characterized as that of a deceiver, also was withstanding Jewish understanding of heresy in later times. So again, he among Christians that I found, he is the only one who agrees pretty much with the scholars that this stuff needs to be discounted. Most likely what it is answers to it. Okay, we come to this point and we have to consider what really do we have to say about this? We have Christian scholars saying that yes, this tells us that the rabbis actually had information or tradition back to actually Jesus in the first century. Scholars say no, it's actually the exact opposite. They actually got this stuff from there. And the rabbis talk about different people having lived at certain times. So how are we supposed to understand this? Okay. William, how much time do I have?
We are sitting right now at 48 minutes.
48 minutes.
Yes,
okay. What I'm going to do now is give you what I think is most likely what the case of, because there are some interesting points that are seen there. It cannot be denied that there are some similarities and ideas that we see there, things that we see in those stories in the Talmud, which we find in the New Testament, which can lead some people to believe that there's some kind of interaction between the two. But how is this interaction to be known? My view is like this. We do have an instance where we can compare historical information and what appears in the Talmud later on, and to see how accurate that is. And the story that we have here appears in Josephus, Book 13, Chapter 10, Paragraph 5. Now, what's the story here? There was a king, Yochanan Hyrcanus, who was from the Hashmonaim, and there was a story about his mother that she had been captured and freed, and this caused a certain problem. So, as Josephus mentions here, now there was one Jonathan, a very good, great friend of Hyrcanus, but of the sect of Sadducees, whose notions are quite contrary to those of the Pharisees. Oh, one second, a little bit earlier. So it says here, so now Hyrcanus was a disciple of theirs, meaning of the Pharisees. A very important point, I will bring this up again and again and again, it's very important to know, that the Maccabees and the Jews before that were all disciples of the Pharisees. That's who were the leaders of the time in that time. We find first, and this is the first instance where we see that the Sadducees actually had some influence at all. before that, no. And when he once invited them to a feast and entertained them very kindly, when he saw them in a good humor, he began to say to them that they knew he was desirous to be a righteous man, and to all things whereby he might please God, which was a profession of the Pharisees also. However, he desired that if they observed him offending in any point, and going out of the right way, they would call him back and correct him, on which occasion they attested to his being entirely virtuous, with which commendation he was well pleased. But still there was one of his guests there, whose name was Eliezer, a man of ill temper and delighting in seditious practices. This man said, since thou desirest to know the truth, if thou wilt be righteous and earnest, lay down the high priesthood and content thyself with the civil government of the people. And when he desired to know for what cause he ought to lay down the high priesthood, the other replied, we have heard it from old men that thy mother had been a captive under the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes. This story was false, and Hyrcanus was provoked against him, and all the Pharisees had a very great indignation against him. So we see there's a meal, and one of the people tells Hyrcanus that he should give up his high priesthood and just be the king because of a story about his mother. So what happens after that? Now there was one Jonathan, a very great friend of Hyrcanus, but of the sect of the Sadducees, whose notions are quite contrary to those of the Pharisees. He told Hyrcanus that Eliezer had cast such a reproach upon him, according to the common sentiments of all the Pharisees, and that this would be made manifest if he would but ask the question, what punishment they thought this man deserved, for that he might depend upon it, that the reproach was now laid on him for the approbation, if they were for punishing him as his crime deserved. So the Pharisees might answer that he deserved stripes and bonds, but that it did not seem right to punish reproaches with death. Okay, so very light punishment, but still something. Indeed, the Pharisees, even upon other occasions, are not apt to be severe in punishments. As this gentle sentence, Hyrcanus was very angry and thought that this man reproached him by the approbation. It was this Jonathan who chiefly irritated him and influenced him so far that he made him leave the party of the Pharisees and abolish the decrees they had imposed on the people and punish those that observed them. So he started persecuting. Okay, this goes on. We'll deal again with this stuff when we deal with rabbinic authority and stuff of that nature. Now, what makes that interesting is we in fact have that same story related in the tractate Kedushin. Remember, the Talmud was not actually set in written form until about the 5th century. So we're talking about a period of a few hundred years later. So what's the story here? Okay, there was at that time a person who was a mocker, a letz, with a bad heart. Again, describing pretty much what Josephus says. The name he has, Eliezer ben Padiah. He has the name Eliezer, where Josephus Eliezer was his name. And he said to Yanai, King Yanai, which is Hyrcanus, okay, so one second. They have a little bit, they have his friend's name was Eliezer rather than the person who spoke against him. Says, what should you do? You should put on your he tells me you should put on your high priestly clothes. So one old man named Yehuda ben Gedira was there, and he said to Yehuda ben Gedira that the crown of kingdom is enough for you. Leave aside the crown of priesthood to the other children of the Harem. Because he said that his mother had been captured beforehand, the same story before. But they looked and they found the story was not true. So we have a different name, but essentially the same story. So anyways, the rabbis were very upset about this. So the king's friend, Eliezer, says to him, that I should ask what they should do with him, and they give a very light punishment. And when they gave a light punishment, then he became a heretic and he became a Sadducee. So the story is essentially the same. Even though it's many hundreds of years later, the story that Josephus has to say is in the Talmud. Now, what's important about this is, of course, we know that Josephus was not very highly kept by the Jews, but was not very highly held by Jews. So what does that tell us? Number one, when we were talking about the stories in the Talmud, when it says that Yeshiva ben Parachi had a student named Yishai, Yeshiva ben Parachi had a student named Yishai. He existed then. Something happened, he was executed, and that's what happened. Also, there was a person named Ben Padira, who lived after the destruction of the Second Temple, either in the time of Rabbi Akiva or maybe 34 years early. But these were real historical people. Okay? They were real people that exist. Okay? So we have to accept that these are real stories. So this eliminates a number of things. First of all, the Christian view that we've seen, that it's telling us stories about Jesus, can only be the case if we are saying that the information flow goes from the rabbis in the Talmud to the New Testament, and not vice versa, or that they're talking about similar things, but it's going that way. Then, of course, it seems to indicate to me that the scholars are actually not correct, that there actually was a real person, but the question is this Jesus or not? Now, what we do find interesting, and I'll try and wrap it up now because I see it's probably getting to my time.
Okay.
What we see from the story of Yeshiva ben Parachia can indicate something to us. The story of Yeshiva ben Parachia brings a few interesting things which correspond to the New Testament. One of them is Jesus goes into Egypt. Now, we find that story in the book of Matthew. What's interesting is, why would and his wife go hundreds of miles away when they could have fled Herod's kingdom north, going to Galilee, which they lived, and just crossing the border going further north, and they would have been out of Herod's kingdom completely? Why would they have to travel so far away? Maybe that story, that legend of that person, was floating around at that time and got picked up. Distinct possibility that, in fact, the information flow into New Testament was from those legends. Remember, we talked about with Michael Lacona, talking about how legendary material gets put into things. Well, legendary material is not necessarily about the person itself. Anybody who knows about Hasidic stories knows that, in fact, you will find that in later generations, a story from a long time earlier, which was told about one Rebbe, sometimes is recast and told about it with the name of a different Rebbe. If you go back, you can find where the real source was and was just said secondarily. So these things can happen. Secondly, Jesus' death around the Passover time is clearly there in the Talmud. Again, this is something that happened by the person at the time of Yeshiva ben Parachia earlier. That story might have also floated in. The accusation of being a magician might also be indicated also in the New Testament, trying to say why they didn't like him, because we know that there was a heretic of another time who was a magician. So they said that that's what it was. The possibility exists, in fact, that the true story is there was a person who lived in the time of Yeshiva ben Parachia. It may be the stories from the time of Yeshiva ben Parachia actually became what was taken in to some things in the New Testament, picked up with other stories that were going around. And so that's where those stories came from. I'm saying this is a possibility, but certainly one thing we can say for a fact. There was a heretic who lived in the time of Yeshiva ben Parachia who was executed. There was a second person who lived in the time of Ben Pendira, called Ben Pendira, who lived in the time of Rabbi Akiva, or maybe a couple decades earlier. Okay. But these were real people that existed. The Talmud tells stories about real people that existed. We can see that from Josephus.
Okay, but you're not necessarily saying, or you are necessarily saying, that you believe that the Jesus of the New Testament existed, or could have been another one mentioned in the Talmud?
Well, no, the Talmud tells us nothing about Jesus.
Right.
Directly.
Okay.
Because it's pretty much except, I think Rabbi Yechiel of Orleans, where he says that he's not mentioned at all, is probably correct. I do not think that it makes sense to say that he lived in the time of Yeshiva ben Parachia earlier, because there's too many other stories which put historical events and periods that in the New Testament. For example, Pontius Pilate. It's pretty certain that Pontius Pilate was the person who executed Jesus. There's pretty much not any doubt as far as in my mind as far as that's concerned.
Okay, gotcha.
So, leaves us having to do it. But my point is, in fact, that the Talmud does not give us information.
Right.
Do I have another 5 minutes?
If you want it, go for it.
Okay, fine.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Now, let me give you. I wrote down my conclusions here because this will make it clear what I'm trying to say here. We have certain possibilities. Okay, basically three possibilities that could be. Number one, the Talmud could be talking about real people, and it could be talking about the real people. Number two could be what the scholars say the Talmud is totally bogus, or number three is maybe there's some kind of mixture of the two. Now, if we accept, as I certainly do, that the Talmud is talking about a historical figure, we're really set with basically two possibilities. Either the Rambam and the Ramban are correct, that Jesus lived in late 2nd century, early 1st century BCE, or it's the same situation as Tosfos would say, and Ibn Yechiel would say, that we have absolutely no information from the Talmud about Jesus at all. It would be one of the two. Now, obviously, it certainly helps. This information that if the Talmud is true, doesn't help us about Jesus at all. We have no information about Jesus from the Talmud because either it's not Jesus, all whole New Testament is wrong, and Jesus actually lived, 100 years earlier, or it's not just him at all. Okay. Second possibility is that the Talmud is actually bogus. These are fake stories that scholars want to say, either made to attack the Christians or whatever. In which case, it's also not helpful for the Christians at all. Because if the stories aren't true, who cares what's in them? The information to make up these stories would have come from the Christians anyways, so it doesn't tell anything. So either way, if it's true or it's not true, it doesn't help the Christians in any way whatsoever. Because either Jesus would have lived at the wrong time, or if they're bogus and the stories are just not true at all, they just came from the Christians anyways, so we really have nothing from it. To quote from the Talmud really doesn't help. Now, as I said, it could be the possibility that's actually composite. Person Yeshiva ben Prachi actually lived, but he wasn't Jesus. But the stories told about him were picked up later by Christians and incorporated in the telling of the story about Jesus. So the story about, for example, the Shem Prachia and Yisha going to Egypt gets somehow brought in, that somehow or other they knew that this guy was supposed to be in Egypt, so it becomes part of his birth story that they fled to Egypt. Especially considering the verse that's in there is like pretty bizarre how that fits there. So either are the possibilities, but the bottom line actually what it comes out to is the claim that the Talmud actually gives some support for Christianity, or the story of Christianity, is something that is just not tenable. It's not believable, not possible. Okay, let me end there.
Okay, very good.
Next week, we're going to wrap up. I have one more historical issue based on outside sources that I want to cover. But essentially, next week, we're going to end. What I'd like is that we'll probably have some time, because I don't think it's going to be more than 15 minutes to 20 minutes, maybe a half hour at most.
Okay, fair enough.
Time left to finish up this thing, and I'm not going to start a new thing then.
Right.
So what we might do is open up for questions. Obviously, I'd like questions on the material, historical material, but if not, we could talk about other things also.
Sure.
Other politics, baseball. I don't know, anything.
All right, fair enough. Sounds good.
Anything that has any kind of religious.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Anything
By the way, were there any questions in the box? I should have asked.
Actually, I have no idea, but we're way past our time anyway, so it wouldn't do a whole lot of good right now. So
okay.
Maybe on next week we'll certainly have time. So, Rabbi, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you and appreciate all the viewers out there.
You know what? I'm going to take a look once you post it out. I'm going to look through the thing.
Okay, good.
See if there's any good questions. I'll make a note of those, so maybe they'll fill in the extra time, because I don't like starting news material.
Perfect. Sounds good. Rabbi, thank you. You guys have a great week. Shavua Tov. And until next week, Hashem willing, we'll see you guys later on the other side. Bye.
אני אתה אתם תמיד תמיד כולם ביחד חשוב מכל חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד איפוק זו העוצמה ויתור זו הגדולה השאיפה והכמיהה אני אתה אתם תמיד תמיד כולם ביחד חשוב מכל חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד.